You're listening to the Business for Good podcast, the show where you'll hear inspirational stories about companies making money by solving some of the world's most pressing problems. I'm your host, Paul Shapiro, and I'm glad you've joined us. Hello, friend, and welcome to episode number 133 of the Business for Good podcast. If you listened to the last episode, you already know that there is an updated paperback edition of my book, Clean Meat, that is coming out on April 9th, 2024. I announced in that episode that, aligning with that book release, this show will be devoted for a couple months exclusively to interviews with leaders in the cultivated meat space, many of whom are profiled in the book. And there is perhaps no person in the cultivated meat sector who has generated more headlines than Josh Tetrick, CEO of both Eat Just and Good Meat. Along with people like Mark Polst and Valeti, both of whom will also be guests in this podcast series, Josh was one of the very first entrepreneurs to devote resources to trying to commercialize cultivated meat. And his company, Good Meat, indeed was the first company ever to win regulatory approval anywhere in Singapore and start selling real meat grown without animal cells. In the new paperback edition of Clean Meat, I detail the process of that Singaporean regulatory approval and the world's first historic cultivated meat sale. And while Good Meat has gone on to raise hundreds of millions of dollars in venture capital funding and garner U.S. regulatory approval as well, the company admittedly has not yet achieved the goals that it set out for itself in the earliest days. For example, in the recent New York Times obituary for cultivated meat, the author Joe Fassler writes, and I'm quoting him here in the New York Times, "The book Clean Meat describes Mr. Tetrick looking at factory drawings and saying, by 2025, we will build the first of these facilities, and by 2030, we are the world's largest meat company." Well, today in 2024, Good Meat no longer has an aspiration of a major 2025 cultivated meat plant, and the idea of being the world's largest meat company by 2030 seems relatively unlikely. But, as you'll hear in this interview, Josh remains cautiously optimistic about a future for the cultivated meat industry, despite negative headlines that are, at least for the time being, dampening some investors' enthusiasm for the space. In this episode, Josh and I have a frank discussion about the cultivated meat sector, how it may be able to scale, what the economics could look like, whether Josh thinks it's realistic to make a dent in total meat demand, and much, much more. Longtime listeners of the show will remember that Josh was also a guest on this podcast way back in 2019 on episode number 23. In that conversation, we discussed how he remains resilient in the face of adversity. I recommend going back and listening to that inspirational episode for sure, and I'm glad to have Josh back on the show again to offer his point of view on where things stand in the movement to divorce meat production from animal slaughter today. Josh, welcome back to the Business for Good podcast.
Good to see you, Paul.
Yes, great to see you too. Okay, let me not beat around the bush. So people are writing the obituaries for cultivated meat, right? You know, you've got the Upside announcement recently. They're putting their factory on hold. Eat Just is putting its factory on hold. Believer Meats does appear to be still building a factory in North Carolina, but they haven't even received approval from regulators yet to start, serving, even if they do finish this and are able to commercially produce. So what's going on? What's happening in this field right now that is leading to these outcomes?
Well, I think it's important to remember the industry is not 50 years old. It pretty much just started 7 years ago or so.
Right. I think it started with the publication of Clean Meat, I'm told. That's what I've heard, at least.
That's usually the marker. So how many years ago was that?
That was 6 years ago, but there's a new edition. There's a new edition coming out in April of 2024.
About 6-7 years ago, the entire industry started. So I think it's important to just for folks to say that out loud, meditate on it, and maybe relax a bit. So since the entire new industry of making meat in a different way, different than it's been made for tens of thousands of years started, multiple companies have been approved to sell. We have sold thousands of pounds of real meat without the need to slaughter an animal. Thousands of consumers have experienced for the first time. The Federal Drug Administration and the U.S. Department of Agriculture have both said that eating real meat, cultivated meat, clean meat is safe to consume. I'm in a facility right now that has been granted the USDA grant of inspection. There's been enormous progress, and there's a lot more to come. And that's what's going on. And a lot more to come is really about how do you not make thousands of pounds, which we can do today, but how do you make millions and tens of millions of pounds at a cost that's anywhere close to the cost of chicken, beef, and pork and other conventional products? And that is inherently challenging. There's a lot of technology necessary to do it. There's going to be a lot more capital required to do it. But two things can be true, my friend, at the same time. One is you can have enormous progress starting from literally nothing. And then the other thing can be true is you need to do a lot more. And that's the case with this industry today.
Yeah. So has anything happened, Josh, that leads you to believe that it isn't technologically possible? Not that I'm not saying it's going to be hard or it's going to require huge amounts of money, but is there anything that has led you to believe there's some physical or technological hurdle that just can't be surpassed?
No.
No. Okay.
I think the technology is here around cell line development, around design engineering of vessels, around cell density. Now, just because the building blocks are here doesn't mean that Good Meat and other companies are necessarily going to solve it. It doesn't mean that it's not extremely challenging. It doesn't mean that it's guaranteed. But the framework of the technologies, plural, are here for us to be able to do this. We just have to execute over the long term and do it.
So would you say that the technology already exists to commercially produce at scale, or would you say things still have to be invented? Like there still need to be new inventions or at least new breakthroughs that are going to allow for either cheaper media or cheaper bioreactors or something else? Like, is it just if somebody offered you $1 billion right now, would you already have accomplished all of the science that needs to be done in order to commercially scale, or would you still be building the airplane while in the air?
Well, let me define what I believe commercial scale is, because I think sometimes people have different definitions of this. So 50 yards from me, we have a facility that costs tens of millions of dollars to build around a 3,000 liter vessel. And you could walk in it and think it's a big facility, right? And it's the biggest or one of the biggest cultivated meat facilities in the world. But we look at that as a pilot plant or a demonstration facility or a very small scale facility, to use just plain spoken language about it. To really scale commercially, we think a facility needs to produce tens of millions of pounds, which is sufficient volume necessary to supply the United States from a national retail or food service distribution perspective at a cost that's close to chicken, beef, and pork today, right? That's what's necessary. We think the ability to make it at that poundage is available today. We think there are a lot of challenges in making it at that cost today. We think there need to be advances in cell density. We think there need to be advances in media. We think there need to be advances, I think really importantly, in how these facilities are designed. I think the technologies exist. It's a question of how smart we and other companies are at integrating them, at effectively raising money for them, at doing the fundamental research to bring them to life.
Got it. So there still are breakthroughs that need to be made, but none that you think are impossible to make as you continue to seek to get the capital to do this, right?
Correct.
Okay.
That's right.
All right. So, Joe Fassler, the guy who used to write for The Counter, and a few years ago, he wrote this story, basically writing the obituary for Cultivated Meat in The Counter. And then, oddly, then The Counter itself went out of business. Then again, like a year or so later, he wrote another piece, again, writing the obituary for Cultivated Meat. And then recently, he wrote an obituary for Cultivated Meat in the New York Times that got a lot of buzz. And in the New York Times column, he mentions that in the book Queen Meat, which again came out in 2018, that you said that you wanted to be selling by 2025, which obviously you've already accomplished before then, but that you want to be the world's biggest meat company by 2030. Now, of course, often aspirations take time to achieve and business plans really survive first contact with reality. But what do you think now? We're now in 2024. Presumably you're not going to be the biggest meat company in 2030, or do you still think that? Like, when do you think that you can be, even if not the biggest meat company, akin to a large meat company that's selling not just tens of millions of pounds, but that's selling billions of pounds of meat?
So it's a question of, to answer that question, it's unpacking what is the timeline ultimately to build what I would define as a large scale facility. And a large scale facility, tens of millions of pounds. It's not going to happen in 24. We're not going to get a large scale facility again in the way that I defined it before the end of 25. So now you're looking at 26 plus. And that'll depend on whether we can execute on the different elements around process development that we're currently executing on, whether we can design a facility not for $1 billion, but in my mind, under $200 million, which I think is actually the most significant challenge here. Even if we had, $5 billion and we could build multiple large scale facilities, the industry needs to figure out a way to build these facilities under 200 million. I think to do them at $1 billion is not viable. So to predict a timeline is just predicting these different elements across the timeline. So not 3 years, somewhere north of 3 years. Mm-hmm. But I do think just broadly, Paul, that it has never been the case that just because there was a headline that said cultivated meat is here, that cultivated meat has been here for 300 million Americans and 8.2 billion people. That is a headline that someone in a newsroom decides to write to accompany an article in order to get clicks, in order for that outlet to make money. That is different than the actual reality of the thing. And I think sometimes these articles that come out are addressing headlines that say cultivated meat is here, again, defined as literally everywhere. But of course, it's not literally everywhere. It's in a single stinking restaurant, right? Now I'm super proud, right, of it, but that's quite different. I will say also that if we want a good assessment of the potential to make clean meat, to make cultivated meat, right, you might want to look at what the meat industry is actually doing about it. Because if I was a meat industry and I thought this technology had no potential, if I thought it was irrelevant, if I thought it was only going to be relevant in 80 years, you know what I would do? Ignore it, not pay attention to it. Instead, we have quite the opposite reaction. We have an active effort to actually ban consumers from purchasing it, active across multiple states and more than one country. So it begs the question, right? Who knows more about the potential of making meat in this way? A handful of critics on the side, or a multi tens of billions of dollar meat industry who's been doing this for decades and decades. I think they probably know what they're talking about, and I agree with them.
Okay. Yeah. And, look, you have numerous states now trying to ban the sale of cultivated meat, not just labeling, but to actually ban the sale, right? There's even a bill in Congress right now that would ban cultivated meat from being served in the school lunch program. There's this, really serious effort to try to crack down on this, which means that the companies in this space are going to have to, use some of their capital to fight these bills when it's very difficult to raise capital at all. So I think that you're raising, a good point in terms of what the meat industry sees as a threat, whether they're informed or not. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. It's hard to know how many of them, because some of them are actively involved in this space also. So I have a feeling that some of them are not in agreement with each other about this technology, and whether they should be embracing it or not, I don't know. But I want to ask you about the economics of this, because you're mentioning, let's say, building a plant that can make tens of millions of pounds, and the plant will cost, let's say, $200 million, as you alluded to a moment ago. So if it's a $200 million capex, and let's just say it's going to produce 30 million pounds of cultivated meat a year, and you're going to sell that at $5 a pound, let's say, which is, around beef prices, but more expensive than chicken. So, it's $150 million of revenue a year in that case. And, I don't know what the margin is, but, it's going to take quite some time to pay off that initial plant, right? Pay off that initial $250 million if you're making, only, $10 or $20 million in profit a year. So how do you make the math work there? Is it that you're going to hybridize those 30 million pounds of animal cells and with plant-based material, so you're selling more than 30 million pounds of product? Is it that it'll be higher than $5 a pound? Like, how do you pay off the plant so your rate of return is actually attractive?
Well, I guess we don't look at rate of return in the way you just described. So you could just do what you described. You could have a company that's worth $2, $3, $4, $5 billion on the market, and then investors can sell their shares for that, and it's disconnected from the exact amount of capital that one invested in it, right? So as an investor in a company like this, this is not a real estate investment, right? I'm assuming, right, the highest probability of my return is going to be coming from some significant acquisition or some public market event. That's one. Two is, just to be clear, we have not figured out yet how to build that kind of facility for $200 million. I think it is the most fundamental task of the cultivated meat industry to figure out how to do that. I can say unequivocally, I do not think the cultivated meat industry will eventually be the meat industry if it costs $1 billion to build these large scale facilities. We all need to figure out how to make them for significantly less money, and that will be challenging to do. But making hybrid products certainly will be a part of it. We make a product today that's 60% cultivated meat. I will say, though, we don't call it a hybrid. It's on the menu as cultivated meat. Consumers enjoy it. Just like if my friend is going to Walmart and buying a pack of Tyson chicken nuggets that has plenty of plant material in it, the Tyson nugget doesn't say a hybrid nugget. It just says a Tyson chicken nugget. But we do think initially bringing down the amount of cultivated meat in it will help improve the economics until we continue to progress this forward.
Got it. So what's the pathway? I mean, if investors right now, at least, are not so interested in this space as they were a few years ago, is the pathway government funding? Is it going to be some other type of grant or low interest loans from USDA? But what do you see as the pathway to realistically scaling up to the point where there's tens of millions of pounds? And of course, there's 100 billion pounds of meat produced in the US alone each year. So to even get to 1% of that, 100 million pounds, it's going to take a long time and a lot of money. So what do you think is the path to actually getting to 1% of the meat industry, which plant-based meat is not even at yet?
Yeah, I guess, Paul, I will say when one says, investors are into something or not into something, I've been doing this job, for now close to 13 years. I've had many occasions where investors have been into something and then not into something and then into something and then not into something and then 5 more times. So when I hear someone is not into something, it's like hearing there's a thunderstorm outside and knowing eventually the thunderstorm will be a sunny day. And when I see a sunny day, my assumption is not that I'll always need to put sunblock on. My assumption is it will eventually rain. So I don't gyrate back and forth between whether someone's into something or not into something. I just try to stay focused on what is, which is the conventional meat industry is ripping the roots out of the planet on a daily basis. We need a way to replace it. Cultivated meat has enormous potential to do so. Therefore, I put my head down and do work to try to increase the probability of doing it. But to get to even the 1%, which you say, it's going to require companies like ours figure out a way to increase our cell densities in a sterile environment, in facilities that I think are south of $200 million. And I do think investors will be interested in that proposition. I do think governments will be interested in that proposition. And, I will say too, cultivated meat is not the first industry where folks look at the beginning of it, turn their nose up to it in some part, and then it becomes ubiquitous. Literary Digest back in the day wrote, this was an expert, "The ordinary horseless carriage is at present a luxury for the wealthy, and although its price will probably fall in the future, it will never, of course, come into common use as a bicycle on laptop computers." The New York Times in 1985 said, "For the most part, the portable computer is a dream machine for the few. The real future of the laptop computer will remain in specialized niche markets." The point is, folks say stuff, they're right, they're wrong. I've got shit to do. Right? I just got to put my head down and do work, because the alternative is a lot worse.
So do you think it will take government funding, like an Inflation Reduction Act type bill where huge incentives are offered to companies to make shifts like this? Or do you think it can still rely on the private sector for this?
I think just like with renewable energy, I think the cost of solar, wind, geothermal, other renewable technologies will continue to drop without government support. But government support accelerates that drop. So I think cultivated meat can do it without the government, but it certainly will accelerate its transition if the government is involved.
Mm-hmm. And do you think there are any countries in particular, whether in Asia or the Middle East or anywhere else, that are doing a better job than the US in terms of providing public support for this industry?
I think it's too early to tell right now. I think governments have made pronouncements about things, but a pronouncement is a lot different than like substantive funding. China has called cultivated meat one of the key technologies in their food security plan, but I think it's to be determined how things like that are actually translated into real policy, not just, on a piece of paper and funding.
Right. I mean, if you think about it, like I just put solar panels on my roof, and these are panels that, of course, were produced in China, right? Because the Chinese government actually had policies to incentivize solar photovoltaic technology there, whereas the US, until the IRA, really didn't, right? And so now we import most of our clean energy tech from Asia, whether it's solar panels or wind turbines and so on. Do you think that the US is at risk if we don't prioritize cultivated meat and other animal-free protein technologies of having to import clean protein technology in the future?
I don't think, yes. And I don't think that's any different than any technology that we intentionally get behind on, right? If you're behind on a technology that turns out to be vital, you're necessarily going to be importing that technology, and cultivated meat is no different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Well, let me shift for a second, because you have recently put out again Just Mayo, which was discontinued about 3 or 4 years ago and is now back on the market, much to my mother's delight. She's like one of the biggest Just Mayo fans out there. In fact, many years ago, you gave her oh, there you go. All right. For those listening, Josh has put a Just Mayo jar in the video here. But my mom still has her Just Jolene mayo jar that she keeps as like a flower vase on her counter. But she's very happy that it's back on the market. But it reminds me of many years ago, you showed me this chart. And it was a chart of all the SKUs of products that you wanted what was then Hampton Creek to have, right? And it was ice cream and cookies and mayos. And then a couple years later, you told me that you wanted to burn that chart. You said that having that chart was one of the worst things that you had done, that you said that you thought that it was something that took too much focus off of the core things that you wanted to do, which were basically eggs and meat. So let me ask you, now you're going to have, Just Egg and however many SKUs of Just Egg there are, whether it's folded or the liquid, you're going to have Just Mayo. Are there other launches that you're going to be putting as like just cookie dough coming back, just birthday cake? Are those coming back also?
Yeah, no, we don't. We're not planning on bringing the cookie stuff back, but we are thinking about some new categories in the plant-based space. I think there are a couple categories out there where the products just are not good enough. And I think folks in the space need to be okay just saying it's just not good enough yet. That we're doing some early research on, both in eggs and dairy, and also the meat side. And when I step back and look at this year, Paul, the single most important objective for us this year is doing a set of things that increase the likelihood we get to break even, right? That's what I want to make sure that we're able to do this year. And it'll be challenging to do it. We got to continue to grow. We've got to continue to improve our margins. We got to continue to watch our expenses. We got to do lots of things like negotiating better rates with warehouses, right? It's not very sexy to talk about on a podcast, but it is the granular, gritty, boring work necessary to run a food company, even if that food company is enabled by a lot of technology. And launching some of these new products are key to making sure we get those margin dollars to be able to fund everything in this damn building, including my own salary.
So probably new SKUs coming out. Who knows what they'll be? But are there things that you're not working on that you hope that somebody else will do? Like if there's somebody listening here and you're thinking, and that person is thinking, well, this category doesn't have the best products that I think it could have. Is there something that you hope that some listener will start themselves?
Yeah, two things. One is, I think a barrier for a lot of people in considering moving to a plant-based diet is cheese. Even though cheese is not as impactful as chicken, as an example, to the planet or to animals, I think it can be the psychological barrier. And I think if someone can actually figure out a way to make a cheese that is actually not just compelling for vegans, but compelling for people who really love particularly stretchable, meltable cheese, I think that's high potential. Probably even more so than that, though. I always think about the work that we do and other folks like you and Alternative Protein do, and how on one hand, it's necessary, and on the other hand, it's completely unnecessary. Because human beings right now could just decide to eat a nice diet of kale and sweet potatoes and beans, and we could retire right now or decide to do something else. I would love to hang out with Ellie, my dog, a lot more than doing this job, to be honest with you. And they can make that decision right now. And I think thinking about ways that you can make those everyday foods that don't require a bit of technology much more appealing to people, brand them better, package them in a more compelling way. I think there's something there that I wish people would do a better job of.
Yeah, so let me say two things in response to that. The first on cheese, I agree. There's obviously far fewer dairy cows than chickens. Of course, cows have a much bigger impact on the planet per animal than chickens do. But while fluid milk consumption has been going down for decades, cheese consumption is going up. And because it takes literally 10 times more milk to make a pound of cheese than a pound of milk, dairy cow numbers have not really gone down because fluid milk consumption is going down, but dairy cow numbers have remained the same because cheese consumption keeps rising.
I didn't realize that.
It's actually, a cheese. So anyway, that means like a cheese replacer, a successful cheese replacer would do 10 times more good than a successful milk replacer, as an example. And then on the other point about making, just conventional plant-based more attractive, I agree. I don't know what somebody would do. It's kind of like saying, like going to the EV market and saying, hey, why don't you just make walking and biking more attractive? Like, wouldn't it be easier just to make walking and biking more attractive than trying to figure out how we're going to get all these rare earth minerals and everything else you need to make all these EVs? People like to drive. So we need to make cars that don't rely on fossil fuels. And people seem to really like to eat meat. Like everywhere on earth, when people get $1 in their pocket, they seem to increase their meat consumption. Whether it's China, India, Brazil, people escape poverty, enter the middle class, the first thing they do is start eating more meat, I should say. And so I would love it if somebody would take the Tetrick principle here and make black beans sexier. But I don't see, why hasn't Goya done this yet, right? Why hasn't Bush's Beans done this yet? They've got a lot of money and smart people. So I don't know why they're not doing it. But I hope that somebody figures out how to do it.
Yeah, but on that, Paul, I mean, think about, I always keep coming back to this idea, how do you make beans sexier? It's this gnawing problem in me that I don't have the actual energy to address because I'm dealing with making vegan eggs and cultivated meat every day. But I feel like there's some unlock there. Red Bull created the entire energy drink category, even though Coca-Cola was, quote, set up and had lots of smart people to do it. And for whatever reason, they didn't figure out how to do it. Tesla created the EV market, even though Ford and GM were, quote, set up and had all the money available to do it. But for some reason, Tesla unlocked it in a way. I don't know what the unlock is. I don't know if it's just a branding thing or something else, but I would love someone out there to make that sexy bean idea come to life and hopefully put me out of business because all people want to do is eat a whole lot of beans. They don't need to mess around with anything that I'm making anymore.
Whenever somebody is like into who's like an anti-food tech person tells me about why what we're doing is bad, I always say, I would love not to do it. It would be so much easier if people would eat tofu and tempeh and seitan. I mean, it would be just amazing. I'd much rather do that than have to harness biotechnology. But sadly, I think human nature is not the way that it is that some of those critics may imagine it to be. I wish it were different.
Yeah, I went to the climate change summit in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, not this past one, but the previous one. And there were these protesters at the entrance to the summit. And there was this young woman who was holding up a sign that said, "Stop fossil fuels today." And she had red tears, like tears of blood coming down her eyes. And she was so passionate. And I went up to her and I said, thanks for like standing for something. And I'm wondering what you think about the whole food thing, because, we got to stop fossil fuels, but you got this like the whole meat thing. And she said, well, I don't know about that. That seems awfully sensitive to wade into. And I just thought it was so interesting that this person had such guts, right, to stand and just yell, "Stop fossil fuels." But to dare wade into the meat topic was to offend someone. And I think we need to get over that.
Yeah. And it's funny you say that. There are some topics that people just don't want to address. And certainly Meat is one of them. But on that final note, Josh, let me ask you if there are any resources that you would recommend to folks. You've been running Eat Just now for 13 years, as you mentioned. Have there been any resources that are useful for you that you'd recommend to somebody else who's thinking about starting their own company, or maybe they want to do something important in the world that you would recommend?
I'm looking at my bookshelf here. I think I'll give you a couple book recommendations. I think this is one of the best. Thinking Fast and Slow. You probably have read it, Paul, but it's not a book about technology or entrepreneurship. It's just a book about how to think better. And I think when you're doing this kind of work, it's hard to step back and just think about thinking. And this book really digs into an evidence-based approach of just thinking with more clarity. It reduces the probability of you getting fooled. It just increases the likelihood that you'll make smart decisions in life and at work. So that's one. And then the second resource I would say is, I think when you're in this world, it's easy to just listen. It's easy to listen to critics, but it's also easy to just listen to people who think everything that you're doing is great. And I think if you can try to surround yourself with people who will give you extremely blunt, direct feedback when something is not great, it's oxygen. And it's hard sometimes to get that because people don't want to offend. We're social animals. We're not truth-seeking animals. And I think if you try to surround yourself with the truth-seeking kind as opposed to just the social kind, you probably can improve how you're getting shit done.
Yeah, I feel you on that. So our mutual friend, Josh Tetrick, whenever he listens to an interview or a speech of mine, he knows that the only thing I want to know is what could have been done better. I don't want him to say, oh, great job, I really liked it. Just say, what are the things that you think could have been done better? Anything from a 3-minute TV interview to a 30-minute speech, anything. And there's very few people who actually tell you the truth. I think my wife, Tony, is one of them. She has no problem telling me the truth, honestly. But also Josh Tetrick is somebody who I always ask, what could be done better? And he of course, is the same. He always wants to know what could be done better as well. And so next time I see you screw up or do something suboptimal, I'll make sure to let you know how it could have been better. Okay.
So that means I'll be hearing from you about 5 times a day. So
okay.
That'll be good. That'll be good for me.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Josh. It's great to talk with you about the future of the cultivated meat space. And if you want to learn more about the origins of the Eat Just Cultivated Meat program, you can check out the new edition of Clean Meat, now coming out on April 9th, 2024, everywhere books are sold.
Thanks for listening. I hope you found it useful, and if you did, please let the world know. Leave the show a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast app and share the episode with your friends. Who knows? Maybe you'll inspire one of them to be in the business of doing good themselves.